Hi, my name is Lynn Busenbark and I'm going to show you how to make a double miter napkin and corresponding tablecloth. Here's the napkin. You see it's got a double miter on it and it's finished on both sides. And here's the corresponding tablecloth. Math-wise, to get a 1-inch binding for your napkin, you need to cut a 3-inch strip. That's an inch here, and then a 1/2 inch on each side for seam allowances. The math is the same for the tablecloth border. This is a 4.5 inch border, so I have 4.5 inches, 4.5 inches, and an inch for seam allowances, so that's a total of 10 inches. Math's exactly the same for both of them. The first thing you do after you cut your border strip, we'll talk about the length it needs to be in a little bit. I'm going to take a chalk marker and I'm going to mark a 1/2 inch border or a 1/2 inch hem right here. Now you want to use a marker that you can see, but one that is not heat sensitive, because we're going to do a lot of pressing on this. So if you used a marker that became permanent with heat, you wouldn't want that to happen because this is the right side of the fabric. You also don't want to use a marker that disappears with heat, because then you couldn't see it when you went to iron at the next step. So that's how you prep your border. Now lengthwise, this is just a 1/2 width of 44 inch fabric. And that works pretty well for a napkin that starts out with that ends up to be an 18-inch square napkin. Okay, when you're cutting your borders, you need 4 for each napkin. Each border is 3 inches wide and 1/2 of the width of a 44-inch fabric. So you need a total of 12 inches or 1/3 of a yard per napkin. And now we're going to move to the ironing board so you can see the next step of the process. The first thing you do is you fold the band in half lengthwise and give it a press. Now you can see why you needed to use a non-heat sensitive marker. The next thing we're going to do, because it makes it easier to do it at this point, is fold down one of your seam allowances, and that's why you put the mark there when we were at the table. You need to be reasonably precise when you're doing this, but don't get obsessive about it because you have some ability to adjust it as you go. Now we're going to fold this back over and repress that center line, because that's going to be our pivot point when we get to making our miter. So you want it nice and firm. And now, to make sure you find the center point, so you can center it on your napkin, just fold it in half lengthwise and give it another shot of steam. You do that for all 4 of your borders, and then you're ready to move to the sewing machine. This is a 18-inch napkin that's been cut to 17 inches square. I use a commercial napkin because I like the feel of them, but I cut the edges off because commercial napkins never seem to come out square. So this started with the 18-20 inch napkin. I cut the borders off to bring it down to a 17-inch square napkin. And then I pressed it so I have nice sharp middle of each one of the sides. Open it up, take your first border and find your middle sections. Give it a pin. And then I like to pin it again down here, just to make sure it stays even while I start to sew. The next thing I need to do is mark a 1/2 inch from this top edge of the napkin. Now I can use any kind of a marker I want here because it's going to be on the inside. Doesn't necessarily have to disappear. And I'm going to mark it right there. I'm not going to mark the other end at this point because I want the machine to move the fabric as it wants to. Now I'm using a walking foot to do this, You can either use a walking foot, or if you have a dual feed on your sewing machine, use a dual feed. But it does really work better with a walking foot or a dual feed, one or the other. And you need an open-toed foot so that you can see where your marks are and you can hit them precisely, because that's important to make sure your miter turns out okay. I'm going to use a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and I'm using the mark on my sewing machine to do that. And I'm going to start stitching right where my dot was. I'm going to take 2 stitches forward, 2 stitches back, and then I'm going to sew my 1/2 inch seam all the way down. Now as I approach the other end, I need to stop and mark my 1/2 inch stopping point. Which is why I need an open-toed foot, so the foot itself doesn't cover up my stopping point until it's too late for me to hit the right mark. I didn't go in quite far enough, so I need to take another look. One more, I think. That's good. I'm going to go back 2 stitches and cut my thread. Now, before I stitch the next one on, I'm going to fold this one out of the way, and I'm going to purposefully make sort of a bump right there, because that's going to be my starting point for the next stitch. Just going to pin that out of the way, pick up another border, move to my center point, align my center points. This method of aligning your center points makes sure that when you get to your miters, you actually have enough room, enough material there to complete your miter. I'm going to put another pin in just to secure it as I move to the end. And I'm still going to mark my starting place, but I'm going to take my finger and sort of my fingernail and sort of and that's where my first stitch starts for my next. I think I missed my mark a little bit on the last one because I'm not quite at a 1/2 inch, but we'll go with this. 1, 2, back stitch 2, so that doesn't pull out. And this procedure goes on all the way around, so you end up with 4 sides. Now when you get to the last side, you really already have those little ends so you don't really need to measure your last one, because you'll have the little nubs from folding back your fabric. And this time I'm going to come in a little farther so I can actually see my stopping point a little better. Much better. Doesn't have to be on it, I just need to be able to see it. Whoops, one too far again. Let's back up. Cut my thread. Okay, we've got all 4 of our borders sewn onto our napkin, and now we need to do the magic miter. You need a 45-degree marking tool. You can either use something like this, but my preference is for a bias square, a square up ruler, because I have this nice bias line and I don't have to move my ruler when I'm marking my bias. I'm going to take the napkin and I'm going to fold it in half diagonally, lining up the raw edges of the seam. I'm going to put a couple of pins in it to make sure it doesn't move. And most importantly, I'm going to line up the edges of this, of the border. If the border is not, if you weren't quite precise enough in your pressing and you end up with something like that, if you stitched it like that and turned it, you'd have this jog on your border when you turned it right side out. So if you have to fudge a little, make sure that your borders line up, even if you have to fudge. And I'm going to pin that right there. I'm going to take that pin out after a little while. I'm going to put another pin in down here because it's really important that this not move off center. And now I'm going to mark my stitching line. If I take my bias square and I lay the bias straight along that fold line that we pressed twice at the ironing board, and I'm going to slide this until the edge of the bias of the ruler goes right to that last stitch that I just sewed on the sewing machine. I have a little dot there so I can get really precise with it. Draw a line to that corner and then another line that way. And that's going to be my stitching line. I'm going to shorten my stitch length a little bit so that I can precisely hit that corner. I'm at 2.25 or something like that. Needle down right where those stitches meet. And I'm going to stitch once again, take a couple of stitches, backspace a little, backstitch a little bit, and then come down right to my point. Half a stitch. And backstitch. Got my stitches. And now I can trim. Now with this napkin, I can trim to about 1/4 of an inch. If I'm making the tablecloth, I leave about 1/2 inch because it's the tablecloth borders really need to have the seams pressed open. This one, I'm going to do a little pressing, but it's not quite as essential. Let's do one more corner just to make sure we have this right. Okay, here I am at the corner. I fold my napkin in half diagonally. I line up my borders so that they're matched. I'm going to try that pin thing again and see if I can get it in a better place. And I'm going to line up the napkin along this way to make sure that I really have a diagonal going there. Take my bias square, line it all the way up and down that press line, move it to where it just ends at the last stitch. And I'm going to draw my stitching line. Make sure you use something that you can actually see on your fabric because you need it to be precise at this point. You can see why I need to use an open-toed foot, because if you were trying to do this with a closed-toe foot, you wouldn't be able to see anything. And trim your seam. We're back at the ironing board now because we've sewn all 4 of our mitered corners, and we're going to turn them. Oh, first let's do a little bit of pressing on this corner. I'm just going to open those seams out. They're not going to open very well because they are really small, but it helps if you can just give them a little bit of help. You turn the corner. inside out. Use your favorite corner squaring tool. This is a dental tool I picked up at a swap meet, I think. It's my stylus. I keep my fingers out of harm's way, and I use it as my favorite turning tool. Turn all 4 of the corners inside out. I've ironed these previously, that's why I'm not doing it now. And your next step with the iron is to press the seam up into your border. You can see that this already happened to this particular napkin because it's going up there very nicely. You'll have to do a little more insistence. Alright, and then you can press your corners and your border down, and when you press your border down, just get it just a skosh over that seam allowance and give it a nice shot of steam all the way around. And press, don't iron, because if you iron, your border is apt to slip a little bit. And now you move back to your sewing machine, and you can either top stitch this border, or, as I prefer to do, and I'll show you on the finished napkin, I like to use a blanket stitch and stitch right here and have it bite in just a little bit. It gives a bit of a decorative look to it. It also gives me a little cheating room on the opposite side in case my top stitching might not work so well on the back side. This is a 2-sided napkin, although frankly I end up with preferring one side to the other. This is the example of the finished napkin. I use the same blanket stitch on the tablecloth. I lengthen the stitch just a little bit and widen it out just a little bit. You can see occasionally I have a little bit of a mishap on the back side, but if my company objects to that, well, they don't need to be company again. Okay, that's all it is to make a banded napkin with a double miter. The formula for cutting the bands will be in the description box of this video, and the same formula works for 1-inch bands, 4.5-inch bands on tablecloths, blankets, etc., etc. Thanks for watching.